Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, a podcast for atheists, agnostics, and whoever. This is episode 14, The Afterlife. Before we get started, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Kurt and Nikki for liking The Week in Doubt on Facebook. And I only have one quick correction or clarification to make this week. In last week's episode, I talked a little bit about Buddhism, and I discussed the concept of a bodhisattva, and I may have given not an erroneous definition, but not a necessarily clear one either. I described a bodhisattva as a being that comes into the world to help mankind, which is essentially true, but more specifically, a bodhisattva is a human or a being, perhaps a divine being or a semi-divine being, that is enlightened enough that they could ascend into nirvana. Nirvana being that ultimate state of oneness or egolessness, where a person is fully removed from having to be part of the endless cycle of birth and death, samsara. But instead of ascending into nirvana, they stay out of a sense of compassion in the world to help other beings become enlightened. I believe with the ultimate goal of not entering nirvana until every other being is enlightened, which would be quite the task, I imagine. So I just want to clarify that. Okay. Well, actually, since that touches on themes of an afterlife in a sense, or divine beings, etc., and the metaphysical, that is probably a decent segue into the topic of the afterlife. So what do we know about the concept of the afterlife? Well, if you go back into prehistory, even the Neanderthals, and it's kind of funny, maybe you were raised like myself to pronounce Neanderthal, Neanderthal, and Cro-Magnon, Cro-Magnon, but seems over time the accepted and probably proper pronunciation is Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, Cro-Magnon being the proper French pronunciation, I believe. But anyway, even Neanderthals who, it's disputed how human they were. I think it's still a point of contention whether or not any of their DNA made it into our DNA, whether or not they had the ability for speech as we know it. Some scientists say no, the hyoid bone, as it were, in the Neanderthal wouldn't have allowed for speech. Then supposedly others disagree with that. But either way, it does seem like they had at least some kind of proto-religion where they interred the dead along with grave goods. Grave goods being items that were buried with the dead, either out of a sense of respect or because it was thought they may be able to use those items in the next life. And if we move up to anatomically modern humans, I believe the earliest human burial was somewhere approximately 130,000 years ago, and the dead were often found in a fetal position and smeared with red ochre in the grave. And this could be to symbolize a kind of rebirth into the next life or the next world, hence the fetal position. And even the red ochre may have been meant to symbolize blood or the bloody fluids that one is born into this world covered in. So it seems from even rather early on, there were these developing beliefs in some kind of afterlife, or at least in symbolic rituals having to do with the interment of the dead. And of course, these rituals and beliefs would become more elaborate and culturally defined over time. And human beings definitely develop some weird beliefs about the afterlife. And it's something I'm thankful for, even though I'm not a believer. From an early age, I've been absolutely enamored of mythology and the kind of strange, wondrous, sometimes lurid symbolism of religion. One of my favorite periods is ancient Egypt. And if we look at the development of ancient Egyptian religion, of course, we all know about mummies and this belief associated with preserving the body so that the soul too may have eternal life. And supposedly, Egyptians learned about mummification actually from Mother Nature, from the desert sands. They saw how corpses, buried in the desert waste became desiccated and to some extent preserved. And so they developed a elaborate man-made method of embalming and preserving the dead. And I absolutely love Egyptian mythology. I love the weirdness of it. I love the pantheon of strange gods, many of them animal-headed. And if you're like me and you ever watch that show, Ancient Aliens, just for kicks, I'm as skeptical of ancient aliens as I am of gods and angels and all the other miscellaneous deities and beings that we find in myth and religion. I do believe that it's just statistically probable that there's probably some kind of life elsewhere out there in the universe. How much of it is intelligent, how much of it is microbial, who knows? But I don't think that aliens came here and built all our ancient monuments and duped us into believing that they were gods or something like that. I actually think it's kind of an insult to human intelligence and human ingenuity to say that extraterrestrials must have built the pyramids or the the great temples of the South and Central Americas. And one of the other things you'll hear ancient alien theorists talk about is it sounds like kind of like this bizarro Stargate inspired stuff, or maybe the series Stargate was inspired by these theories and they predate it. I don't know. But this idea of animal headed gods, these weird hybrids that the aliens made through experimentation or something like that, and that man then worshipped as gods. A better explanation would be that human beings were inspired by the animals that lived in proximity to them, and they ended up incorporating these animals into their myths and religious beliefs. For instance, two of the main Egyptian gods, Set and Anubis, are both canine-headed. Actually, Set is probably only partially canine. His head is kind of more chimera-like. Some think it looks like a donkey. Some think it's part fennec, part canine, even aardvark. Pretty weird. And Anubis, in comparison to Set, was a rather benign god who is what you could call a psychopomp, a guide to the dead, someone meant to guide the dead through the underworld. And in Greco-Roman mythology, we have Hermes or Mercury filling kind of the same role. And it makes sense to me that because wild dogs were attracted to burial areas, probably because of the decomposing flesh, they became associated with death and burial. And the next thing you know, you have a deity with a dog head who represents death and burial. And there's also a couple of different deities, Horus and Ra, that we sometimes see depicted with bird heads. And also Thoth would be another one too. And this makes sense to me too, because in a lot of ancient religions, the sky is associated with divinity or heaven or the afterlife, and birds seemed endowed with this magical power, the ability of flight, the ability to touch the heavens. So it makes sense that you, in a lot of cultures, will either see bird-headed deities, as you do in ancient Egypt, or in Mesopotamia, say with Ahura Mazda, you see winged gods. So I don't think we need ancient aliens to explain why why ancient divinities had animal attributes. And before I get any Stargate fans mad at me, I should say, yeah, I know that the aliens in Stargate are just wearing animal masks and they're not hybrids. Just felt I had to clear that up. But as I was saying, we don't need ancient alien theories to explain why ancient gods had animal attributes incorporated into their being or their likeness. One of the fascinating things about religion to me, and maybe one of the most disturbing things, at least it used to be when I was first studying this stuff, is that religion does not always guarantee an afterlife. And if I draw an example from ancient Egyptian religion, there was something known as the weighing of the heart ceremony. And if you Google the weighing of the heart, you can find some really cool pictures. It's a reoccurring theme in ancient Egyptian religion that I love, that depicts the judgment of the dead. You'll have the god of the dead, Osiris, presiding over the ritual. You'll have a set of scales where, with the dog-headed god Anubis that I mentioned before, attending the scales. And you'll have the feather of Mot, Mot being an Egyptian word for truth, basically, sometimes embodied by a goddess of the same name, I believe. And the feather on one side of the scales, and the heart of the dead on the other side of the scales. And if the person's sins weigh heavier than the feather, then instead of living on for eternity, the person's heart is taken and thrown to this kind of nightmarish composite monster called Amit. And it's basically this animal that basically has basically has a crocodile face and snout, but is also part lion, part hippo, just a composite of these different aggressive animals. It basically gobbles the heart of the sinner, and then the person is basically, their soul is annihilated or obliterated, and they cease to be. So the idea that within a religion, there could also be the concept of an eternal self that is ended or annihilated. I remember finding that very disturbing early on. And I think it's something that you might actually find in modern Mormonism too. I won't spend too much time bashing the beliefs of Mormonism. I touched on Mormonism and Scientology in an earlier episode. Hopefully it didn't seem like I was bashing the adherents. I was more bashing what I saw as the absurd beliefs. And I went on to say how it's hard enough to believe in a religion that's kind of been grandfathered in, and it's been around for a couple millennia. It's hard enough to believe in a religion like that. But believing in a religion that's relatively new, that was made within the last couple of centuries, I don't get that at all, especially when the beliefs are so outlandish. In the case of Mormonism, you have Joseph Smith, who's basically a glorified con man. In the case of Scientology, we literally have a religion made by a science fiction author. But I'm going to cut myself off before I digress too much and get back on track. But anyway, I think there's a belief in Mormonism, or maybe among Jehovah's Witnesses that there's only, actually, allow me to backtrack. It's not Mormonism. It's definitely Jehovah's Witnesses only believe that 144,000 people get into heaven. And as someone joked about online, which was a pretty good point, it makes you wonder why they work so hard to recruit more people. So what happens to the other people that don't get into heaven? I'm not sure if they just cease to be or what. But that brings me to Judaism and Christianity. It may surprise a lot of people, but there's actually not a heck of a lot of talk of an afterlife in the Old Testament. Ancient Jews, probably somewhat like modern Jews, seem to be more concerned with showing respect to God and living and conducting themselves in a righteous manner than they do worrying about the fate of the soul after death. And it can definitely seem bizarre, foreign to us, I know it does to me, that you could believe in God and fiercely embrace the tenets of a religion without thinking much or being concerned greatly about the fate of the soul after death, or whether or not the soul even survives death. It seems very odd or contradictory, but it does seem to be the case in certain instances. There is that rabbinical idea that I talked about before, which I love, about the souls of the dead being like tiny flames reuniting with the one big flame that is God. Whether that's meant to be taken literally or figuratively, I don't know, but it seems to allude to that sense of oneness that we find in Eastern religion, or in certain cases Christian mysticism, but it doesn't really seem to be referring to the ego self, to the individual self living on after death. As I said, if you go back into the Old Testament, there's not a heck of a lot of talk about an afterlife. There is this one place called Sheol, which is kind of like this gloomy netherworld where if people are doing anything at all after death, they're kind of said to be sleeping. And it's not a place of punishment, at least it's not described as such. It's just a place where all the dead reside, and whether or not it's meant to be taken literally or whether it's meant to be symbolic, I don't know. I believe in the book of Genesis, there is a mention of the figure Enoch, who is this mysterious figure that only appears for a little bit in the Old Testament, but is written about more thoroughly in some outside books of the Bible. But it's said that Enoch walked with God and he was no more, or something along those lines, to insinuate he died and he went somewhere with God. Where to? Maybe heaven? I don't know, it doesn't really say. Then I think it's in the book of Daniel, it mentions something about the dead waking up to either, I'm paraphrasing, eternal life or eternal scorn, which seems to reference the duality of heaven versus hell to some degree. But we have to remember that the Bible, both in the case of the Old and the New Testament, wasn't one book that was written by one author. The Old Testament is basically an anthology cobbled together from different books by various authors, and such is the case with the New Testament as well. And a theory I heard is that in the case of mention of an afterlife in Daniel, might have been something that was inspired by Hellenistic culture or belief, meaning from the Greeks. And our modern concept of hell as this fiery or gloomy place infested with all manner of strange horned creatures and whatnot, that seems to be inspired by both Greek mythology and largely by Dante Alighieri, the author of the famous Divine Comedy. And Dante's image of hell is flavored by Greek mythology as well. And in the Divine Comedy, it's interesting that on the plane where the devil himself resides, it's a kind of frozen waste. You'd expect it, because the common folklore, to be this place of fire, but it's this frozen, cold, gloomy place, which I think is supposed to kind of mirror the despair that comes with being distanced from God. So even in literature, hell isn't always this place of fire that we might imagine. And the Greek Hades, which is at least in part in the inspiration for the modern image of hell, was more of a kind of shadowy netherworld. And the word hell may actually come, at least in part, from Norse mythology by way of the Anglo-Saxon language. In Norse or Viking mythology, there was a goddess, Hel, Hel, who ruled over a netherworld by the same name. Similar to how in Greek mythology, Hades was both the name of the abode and the god who ruled over it. While I'm doing all this talking about hell, I might as well take a moment to talk about the devil and his roots. So we have this modern idea, at least believing Christians do, and even in pop culture, I suppose people do, of the devil as this horned, demonic figure who is a fallen angel who is involved in a war with God and now resides over this place of eternal torment. If you go back to the Old Testament, Satan is a much different figure. The name Satan meaning accuser or adversary, and he was almost a kind of prosecuting attorney for God. There's no mention of hell, no mention of Satan being locked in a battle with God or betraying God. He was more a part of God's court or inner circle, one of the boys, I guess. And it was his job, with God's okay, basically, to test people to see how righteous they were. And the most famous case of that is the story of Job, where basically, kind of crudely, God and Satan wager over how righteous Job is and how much suffering he'd have to be put through before he would turn on God. And we have Job being robbed of all his earthly riches. We have his family being killed off. We have him himself being afflicted with disease. And in the end, although he comes close, he stays righteous and he stays true to God. But every step in the way, Satan had God's permission to test Job. And like a lot of stories in the Bible, I think on the surface it might be kind of lurid, but it's also kind of a beautiful story in a way. That might be an odd choice of adjectives. But like a lot of biblical parables, if you read into them a certain way, they can seem kind of ugly and offensive if you take them literally. But as a kind of mirror of human nature, Sometimes it can be inspiring. The fact that Job can go through all this suffering and still hold true to his convictions. There is something inspirational about that. But back to the point at hand. So in this case, we see Satan's not a demonic form. He doesn't have his own infernal realm that he rules over. He basically works for God. Even in the New Testament, Satan seems to kind of fulfill that role of the adversary or someone seeing how far they can push or test a specific figure. We have the tempting of Jesus by the devil in the New Testament during Jesus' time in the desert, when he offers Jesus essentially the world and tempts Jesus to fling himself down from the pinnacle of the temple to test his own divinity. Of course, firstly, the challenge to turn stones to bread, and basically, check, check, check. Jesus renounces the devil at every turn. The idea of Satan as a rebel angel and a figure flung down from heaven and residing over a place of eternal punishment seems to come from a mix of things. In the book of Isaiah, there's a fleeting mention of a morning star figure who is flung down, and this doesn't seem to, at least on the surface, be referring to Satan as I described him elsewhere in the Old Testament. It may actually be a story borrowed from Mesopotamian belief, and it may be used in the Bible as a kind of parable about the dangers of pride, if you will. And then also, if you go to the book of Revelation, probably the most lurid and at least ostensibly violent in a sense of all the books in the New Testament, it does mention a war in heaven, and it mentions a figure known as the dragon, and of course there's the mention of the Antichrist and all the other kind of over-the-top stuff. And the book of Revelation, written by the exiled John of Patmos, was almost not included in the canonical Bible, and scholars think it may have been a result of a instance of mistaken identity, where it was thought that the author was John the Apostle, but it was John of Patmos. So Revelation almost didn't make it into the Bible. I think even in the early days of the church, there was some concern over the kind of lurid and volatile nature of the book. And that might be the drinking game word of the week, lurid. I seem to be using that adjective a lot this week. So if you take the fleeting morning star reference, the book of Revelation's mention of a war in heaven, mix that with the fact that Satan is seen as an adversarial figure in general. Actually, in Revelation 12:9, it says, "The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to earth and his angels with him." So there in Revelation, we see Satan identified as a fallen figure with a host of rebel angels. And as I was saying, Revelation is a book which almost didn't make it into the canonical Bible. And then there, I think also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was some mention of something like a war in heaven, or the war of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. And that's in something appropriately entitled the War Scroll, or referred to as the War Scroll. And there may have been some other outside texts known of at the time that had to do with fallen figures, etc. And I think all that stuff together, and also mixed with a helping of Greek mythology, in terms of, you take the pagan characters or figures, like Pan, half man, half animal, and you see where eventually that develops into the belief of demons and Satan himself possessing bestial traits like horns and cloven feet. I think probably the two main reasons why I personally doubt the existence of an afterlife is, maybe there's three reasons. One is the seemingly man-made nature of the concept. Every religion, every dead religion, which we now term as mythologies, they all have their different take and their different concept of it. Well, which one's the right one? They all seem pretty man-made. We can see how the ideas develop over time. I guess secondly would be a dearth of evidence, which I'll get to. And thirdly would probably be the seeming fact that consciousness, quote unquote, the soul or psyche, seems to be an emergent property of the brain. And the brain is kind of a fleshy machine, different parts and components that perform different tasks. If you injure a certain part of the brain, you can alter personality and cognitive and emotional function. So I don't really see the individual self surviving the death of the brain. Unless, I always like to try to play devil's advocate against myself just to test the strength of my theories. And I guess if you're going to try to come up with something, maybe you could say that despite the fact that the brain is almost like a meat machine with different parts that perform different functions, maybe as a whole it's some kind of temporary vessel that channels consciousness through it or something like that. A bit of a stretch and pure speculation. It reminds me of, I'm trying to think of the doctor's name. He's an anesthesiologist. I think his first name's Stewart. I forget his last name. He was on a panel with a bunch of quantum physicists and other thinkers. Skeptic Michael Shermer, kind of new age guru Deepak Chopra. And he's an anesthesiologist who has this theory that consciousness resides in the structures within the cells of the brain known as microtubules. And there's this big long theory about how that might allow consciousness to survive the death of the brain or become recycled or exist elsewhere outside the body. I'm not sure how much I buy into it. I'm just bringing all that up to kind of illustrate my point about one of my reasons for why I doubt the existence of life after death being the nature of the brain and consciousness itself. And I did a lot of talking about ancient religion and ancient beliefs about the afterlife. I should probably jump up to more modern times. And what comes to mind for me is during the 19th century, there was a movement called spiritualism. And it's this time we really see the big boom in the practices of things like seances and I guess you could call spectral photography, trying to capture ghosts on camera. And you can even find, kind of weird pictures online from the 19th century, old black and white photos of people puking up, and hopefully you're not eating right now, this white stuff that was supposedly quote unquote ectoplasm. You might remember ectoplasm from Ghostbusters, but it was supposed to be this kind of spiritual goop or residue. And it turns out that what was said to be ectoplasm was usually something like cheesecloth or some type of material the person was photographed with coming out of their mouth. And seances, the people who were in the business of leading seances for, people trying to contact dead relatives were proven to have a bunch of kind of cheap tricks up their sleeves that they used to try to give the impression that there was a ghostly presence at work in the room, where they'd have little bells they wiggled with their toes, or tricks to make tables move and things like that, or trying to produce ghostly voices by some way or another. And actually, Harry Houdini was, you'd expect him to maybe be this kind of mystical figure because he was known as one of history's great magicians. But he was also a skeptic and a debunker, and he had no love for the quote-unquote spiritualists, especially those who tried to dupe people who had lost loved ones and were offering them the promise of being able to contact their dead loved ones again. And that was a big cause of Houdini's, was trying to debunk what he saw as these fraudulent con men who promised to let people speak with the dead. And that kind of reminds me of, right now, and maybe for the better part of a decade, those ghost hunting shows have been all the rage. And before that, we had psychic mediums like John Edwards is his name, or is it James Van Prague, who had these hit television shows where they'd be in a studio audience and supposedly they'd channel the dead, and right there on the spot, they'd find people in the audience and match up the kind of spirit they were channeling to a relative of the deceased in the audience and allow them to talk through them or whatever. And it turns out, call me a skeptic yet again, but it was basically a bunch of BS. It's their main trick of the trade is probably something known as cold reading, and there's something else called hot reading too. Cold reading is when the person takes little steps to try to tease out information, and then piece by piece, as they're drawing information out of a person, they build up on it to make it sound like they have more information than they really do. For instance, the psychic might say, is there someone in the audience who lost someone whose name begins with G? Is it George, Georgia? Oh, maybe someone has a relative that came from Georgia or something like that. And they slowly work like that, trying to tease information out of people while making it seem all the while that they, the medium, are the one who is providing the information and knows all this stuff. And the opposite is hot reading, which is when they actually cheat, when maybe ahead of time they have a helper or a crew member or something actually gather information, provide it to the medium who knows it beforehand, and then it appears like they're talking through the spirit and they have this information they couldn't any other way have. And sometimes the participant, the audience member, maybe they're in on it, maybe they aren't. And I'm not trying to slander Van Prague or Edwards. John Edwards by saying that they were using hot reading. I think that has been implied at times. Not that they'll ever hear this, but I'd rather play it safe and not get sued. But I think there's definitely cold reading going on. And whether or not the psychic himself or herself is aware that they're utilizing cold reading, that's probably debatable, and it probably shifts from, it varies from individual to individual. Some psychics might actually convince themselves on some level that they are really psychic, but they're employing cold reading, and some might just plain and simple be con men. But as far as those ghost hunting shows go, there's a lot of things I have fun watching that I don't necessarily believe in, like the ancient alien shows or shows on Bigfoot or something like that. But to quote Howard Stern, I get a big case of the douche chills whenever I watch those ghost hunting shows. They just seem so ridiculous that you just cringe in embarrassment for the people, but not like they need your empathy. I'm sure they've earned a handsome bit of cash off of their TV shows. But I'm thinking of one in particular. I think it's on the Travel Channel, Ghost Adventures or Ghost Adventurers. And I think it's headed by, is his name Zach Baggins or Zach Baggin? And I don't want to bash him too much. Not that most likely, once again, he'll probably never hear this, but he looks like he could probably kick my ass pretty good. So I think I might just, that might be the third podcast that I've sworn on, the third episode, that might need a explicit rating. But basically, Zach Baggins, or whatever his last name is, and I don't say that glibly, I'm not sure of his last name right now. They go and do what's called a lockdown, where they'll go into a supposedly haunted place. They heroically allow themselves to be sealed in overnight. And that's one of the funny things, is they'll challenge, like with this bravado and indignation, they'll challenge the spirits. How dare you be haunting or people or teasing people from the great beyond or whatever. And they'll really challenge them like they're doing this heroic service to society by trying to drive out these evil spirits. And then all you ever get for evidence is sometimes supposedly someone will be scratched. It'll happen off camera, or it's so dark when they're filming you don't see it happen, but they'll act all excited. They'll lift up their shirt and you'll see these what look like little freshly made fingernail scrapes or something like that. And obviously, not to question their integrity, but they could have done it themselves. Being someone who works in construction, I know how easy it is to accidentally back up against a nail or a sharp piece of debris. But there's a good chance they could be doing it themselves. I don't know. But it doesn't really qualify as scientific evidence in my book, because you never really see it happen on video. They say they got scratched and they lift up their shirt and you see a little something. And the other is the EVP, the electronic voice phenomena, where supposedly they run a tape recorder during the whole time, and when they play it back, you can hear things that you couldn't hear with the human ear the first time around, and supposedly ghosts saying all sorts of ominous stuff. And what makes it cringeworthy and laughable, and if you're someone who cares about the truth, maybe it even upsets you, is that I don't know if they know they're doing it or not, but they utilize the power of suggestion, where they tell you beforehand what they think it's gonna say. Maybe it's the ghost is saying, "I love pork chops" or something. I don't know why I said that. Maybe it's subconscious because of that thing where I gave up eating pork because I saw that animal cruelty video from the Tyson pork supplier. But maybe I have an inner lust for pork that's coming out. But maybe they're saying the ghost says, "I love pork chops," or "I'm the devil," or whatever, and then they'll play the tape, and it sounds maybe very vaguely like that, but it could be just about 100 other things too, depending on your interpretation or what you want it to say. So the evidence seems very flimsy to me indeed. And then I'm thinking like every family probably has some kind of weird ghost story or something. Like in my own family, I know my brothers, when we were younger, I was probably just a really, really little kid, maybe elementary school age at best. They shared a room, and I know for a long time, even into maybe early adulthood or whatever, they would swear that both of them witnessed something like go flying across the room, some type of ghostly apparition. And I think maybe every family has like silly little stories like that. And one of my brothers is deeply religious, and one is probably just as skeptical as I am. He's a very scientifically minded person. And when you look at it, so if I was like elementary school age, they're like maybe in between 5 and 7 years older than me. They were probably quite young too. Brain still developing, probably with a desire to want to believe in things, to get that kind of guilty little thrill you get out of suspending disbelief and allowing yourself to believe that something wild or beyond belief is going on. So their early childhood recollection that they saw something go flying across the room, but who knows, maybe one of them threw something and just went along with it afterwards, or maybe eyes playing tricks in the dark, even like a little spot or floater in your eye at night. Who knows? But all in all, when you look at it, EVPs, seances, mediums with cold reading, the evidence for life after death seems pretty shoddy. And then, of course, there's near-death experiences, which I'm not saying that they're necessarily just a chemical reaction within a dying brain starving of oxygen. But that seems just as good an explanation as that someone's crossing over to some other dimension. And it's even said that certain aspects of the near-death experience, like the tunnel of light, could actually have to do with constricting vision or blood vessels in the brain. Different aspects of the near-death experience could be explained by different aspects of the brain shutting down. It's not necessarily that I don't want there to be life after death. I would love the idea of being eternal. That'd be great. You have forever to take care of your bucket list, I guess. And like I said, I grew up a sensitive kid who wanted to believe, and becoming a non-believer wasn't something I decided I want to do. It was where my reason led me. Just like my reason leads me to doubt the existence of an afterlife until hopefully and happily I'm proven wrong someday. But that leads to one thing that I never would have thought this as a kid, but I know probably after I became a non-believer, I once really thought about, almost as if for the first time, about the concept of eternal life or living for eternity. And there was something almost scary about it. It's something, our lives are so short that we desperately want it longer. We want ourselves and our loved ones to continue on longer. But when you think about forever, that is a long ass time. And it's kind of scary almost when you try to comprehend it. So would you eventually go mad? Would you eventually get horribly bored if you were alive forever? Or maybe, let's say for the sake of argument, there was an afterlife. Maybe there's some kind of phenomenon that allows you to be as if you're always living in the present and you're not aware of, the horrible specter of just how vast forever is. But I've gone on for quite a bit, so we're almost at the 50-minute mark. And hopefully I didn't bum you out at all, because I know it can be a sensitive topic, this stuff about life after death. And like I always say, whether there is or isn't life after death, whether there is or isn't a God. You know, the most important thing is we're here. The people we love are here. This experience is real. And you got to do your best to enjoy this ride, you know, do your best to be a good person and live productively and, you know, try to find what fulfills you in life. So I think there's plenty of reason to enjoy life without having to try to convince yourself that, you know, an afterlife or a God is absolutely out there. Whether it is or not, you know, I have my reasons for doubting, but none of us will know till we get to the quote unquote other side, I guess. So hopefully, like I said, I didn't bum you out too much, and hopefully you enjoyed the episode and I left you with some food for thought. And once again, this has been the Week in Doubt